It is Sunday, February 2nd, and it's getting pretty late with Jake Landau. Welcome to our first inaugural episode of the podcast. This is going to be a weekly show every Sunday evening where we will go over all the horrible things that happened in the last week so you can ruminate on them going into the next week. Now, each week, we will have a different guest from the Canadian commentary sphere, whether they be a journalist, a politician, or an organizer, or a lobbyist. Although we don't have that many lobbyists on the program. Anyways, we'll ask them a bit about their work, but then we'll dive into three of the week's top headlines, including two big ones and one smaller one based on something that's gone a bit under the radar. This week's guest is independent journalist Jeremy Appel. Jeremy is an indie freelancer who is syndicated previously in the CBC, the Toronto Star, the Canadian Jewish News, and many, many other mainstream publications. But his primary focus is on his independent publication, The Orchard. You can read at readtheorchard.org, and you can also listen to his podcast. But also notably, you may be familiar with his book, Kennyism, Jason Kenney's Pursuit of Power, published 1 year ago and chronicling the rise and fall of Albertan politician Jason Kenney. Jeremy Appel, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Jake. It's actually Appel, not to be one of those guys, but
how long have I known you? I am very sorry.
Well, I don't think you've ever had to necessarily say my name out loud. But I do it to myself because, of course, the newsletter is called The Orchard, and my last name is spelt similarly to Apple. So, people make that mistake all the time.
Well, that's a good segue in then.
Yeah. But yeah, it's if it's anyone's fault, it's my own. I don't mind at all. I just, want to set the record straight.
No, of course. Coming from the land of nobody pronounces my last name the same way, I understand the sympathy. I'm sure many people...
Really? Is that right?
I'm sure many people tuning into this program will be delighted to find out that not even my own family can pronounce Landau the same way. So if you've been reading my work for the last year or so, and folks, and you didn't know how to say my last name, I say Landau, but whatever you say is also correct. Just have fun with it.
So people say Lando. Is that a
yes? Yeah, like sometimes you'll get it like Lando Calrissian from Star Wars. So it's fun.
That's kind of cool. That's fun.
Yeah, it's like we like it. We have fun with it. I used to tell people like Martin Landau, like the actor, but unfortunately nobody knows who he is anymore because nobody watches classic movies. Which is a tragedy in itself. It's such a sadness. Speaking on which, rest in peace, David Lynch. Your memory is a blessing, and all of you, please go watch Mulholland Drive. But Jeremy, you're pretty famous for independent journalism in Canada, and I don't use that word lightly. You've got a pretty wide following through your Substack publication, but you also do freelance work for more traditional mainstream publications, and you recently wrote one for the Star, if I'm correct. Yes.
Yes. I wouldn't say, I don't often write for mainstream publications. But this is the first time I was published in the Toronto Star. I think because I freelance a lot here in Edmonton for Alberta Native News. In those stories, often because it's a local journalism initiative position, those stories get picked up in mainstream newspapers, sometimes like Star and the Globe. But this is my first time actually having like a pitch accepted and having it was actually in the print paper, which was really cool because I am a fellow Torontonian, born and raised, and I grew up, reading the Star. So that was pretty cool. But I guess you probably want me to talk about what I actually wrote.
Yeah, your piece was about the Liberal Party of Canada leadership race to determine the next leader of the Liberal Party and the next Prime Minister of Canada without there being a general election, only through a leadership primary. An extremely controversial thing that conservatives were totally happy with when Danielle Smith did it. But now that a liberal's doing it, it's very bad. But you have a unique take on the race. So why don't you tell our listeners more about that?
Well, I think the front runners are obviously Mark Carney and Chrystia Freeland. I thought Freeland would have better shot than it looks like she has. It looks like um, the race is narrowing in Carney's favor.
Yeah, she's
Um,
really going down like a lead balloon, isn't she?
yeah, I mean, yeah, like the Hindenburg.
Yeah.
It's pretty remarkable. I mean, look, we both have some pretty common criticisms of Freeland. But she's smart, and I think during Trump's first term she did a good job securing Canada's interests in the renewed trade negotiations. So but my point is that we're living in this populist age where people's quality of life has gotten worse across the board. I mean, if you look at the price of food, the price of housing, all these essentials, it's going up. Wages are stagnant, jobs are insecure. Um, and you've got Polyev for all his glaring flaws, which we can talk a bit about maybe later. Is tapping into that anger and insecurity and giving people answers and identifying culprits, and it's all bullshit, right? It's all right. Like, oh, your life sucks because of like woke DEI, carbon taxes.
Oh, of course. What would conservatism be without a scapegoat?
Yeah, exactly. And I don't think that's I think it's good. Like, I think that that's something I would like to see, the NDP or, even the Liberals do, is be like, no, actually, your problems are the result of this billionaire class that is able to do whatever it likes, regardless of the consequences for the planet and for the majority of people. But in the Liberal leadership race, I mean, you have two candidates that are really the embodiment of this elite that Polyev talks about, also these global elites, right? These globalists at the World Economic Forum in Davos, and does so in a way that is very conspiracist, right? He's saying that they're socialists, which is
One step
bonkers.
away from the protocols of the Elders of Zion, pretty much.
Yeah, I mean, a couple steps away, but yeah,
Yeah.
it's that definitely. I mean, the conspiracy theory that he is
Yeah.
explicitly dog whistling towards, it certainly has some anti-Semitic variations of it. I don't think he's anti-Semitic, but um, but you have these two leading liberal candidates who are, I mean, the embodiment of this global capitalist class. I mean, Carney was literally, I mean, he was Canada's central banker. He was Britain's. He worked on the UN's, climate committee, which name escapes me, but it was basically a big initiative of his, was getting banks to sign on to commit to net zero, and now they're all leaving that specific alliance, which I think shows the problem with this. Just like, we just want to encourage the financial sector to do better. He took a swing at the far left at his campaign kickoff, as if the far left is as if there's a far left political party in the Canadian House of Commons.
Yes,
Right.
it is curious because many of the same criticisms that are in your piece about Carney and Freeland and the centrist neoliberal tenor are criticisms that are made of the NDP, both at the federal and provincial level as well. And a lot of NDP supporters get very sensitive about those criticisms. And yet, a lot of liberal supporters get very sensitive when those criticisms are levied at their leader. So, perhaps would you say part of the reason they fight so much is because they're more similar than they'd like to admit?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I'm not a member of any political party, but I think at the moment the strategy Jagmeet Singh has adopted, coming after Kamal Kher's aggressive pivot towards this like neoliberal centrism that the liberals have like perfected over the past number of decades, is just to be ever so slightly to the left of Trudeau. So he's not talking about really big systemic changes,
or really defining his own agenda at all.
Yeah, it's very technocratic, like the liberals. It's just, I would say it's a bit more to the left of them. I mean, sometimes you'll hear Jagmeet talk about the billionaire class. I think he's been doing that more now that he's been sort of tainted by this supply and confidence agreement he signed with the liberals. But certainly that critique also applies to the New Democrats. But obviously I focused on liberals because the leader of the liberal race is going to be the next prime minister and is going to be probably the main opposition to Polyev. I mean, before Trudeau stepped down, I mean, the polls were looking like 2011 again, where the NDP would, it would actually, 2011 meets 1993.
Yeah,
it
was quite dire. But while polling disagrees on the margin of things right now, for those listening at home, there is a general consensus that there is now a upswing, although to what degree cannot be determined. However, there is now a perceived potential that the next leader could hold the Conservatives to a minority rather than a majority if momentum continued.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's wishful thinking, because if you look historically, John Turner got a bump in the polls when he was elected leader and got, I mean, absolutely destroyed. I mean, no political leader in Canadian history has gotten destroyed that well. I mean, I guess Michael Ignatieff in a different way, but right? I mean, Mulroney won the biggest majority government ever after John Turner became leader. Kim Campbell got a bump, and that actually no party has ever gotten destroyed as badly as the PCs did in 1993.
True. Although I always caution people on the Kim Campbell example. People forget she was popular to a large extent at the start. And then she put out the attack ad against Jean Chrétien, and it cratered, and it just never recovered. And that is kind of fascinating in itself, a time when there was still a sense of shame in politics. The other parts of 1993 I would not like to go back to. I'm still happier in 2025, although current events are starting to test that theory. But back on the topic of Carney and Freeland, because they do seem to be the two main front runners in this race and the focus of your piece. What main similarities do you see between the two of them? Especially, we've talked about Carney's financial past, like working in the finance industry for Goldman Sachs as a central banker. How do you see Freeland positioned relative to him on the scale?
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, first of all, I think it is worth noting that Freeland and Carney are like good friends, right? I mean, Carney is the godfather of one of Freeland's kids. If you go back and read Freeland's book from 2012, 2013, right before she got into politics, Plutocrats, she writes about Carney and how he is this really like singular figure that is standing between the plutocrats and like the rest of us by encouraging a more active regulatory role for governments in like financial markets. Um, so like honestly, there isn't like Freeland has really hyper focused on first of all on the threat posed by Trump, which I think she is smart to do, because I think her track record on that is pretty solid.
And her
But
stance on it
also,
is more popular than she is to an extent.
yeah, I would think so. And but also just undoing a lot of the things that as recently as last year she was on TV defending, like the capital gains tax increase, which has now been delayed until next year. But if Freeland wins, she's going to scrap it. The carbon tax, which also Carney is committed to scrapping, but I think Carney has put forward a much more plausible alternative to it than Freeland has. So I think Freeland is actually like running considerably right to the right of Carney. You know, you can look at who's endorsing her too, right? Like Anthony Housefather and um uh 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 Randy Boissonneau, which is, I mean, hilarious.
Yes, that was a very interesting endorsement to accept. I thought what's been particularly fascinating was her asking Bill Maher if he would have
Oh my
her on
God.
Club Random. I'm not sure if she's aware that you smoke weed with him on that podcast, which is
Yeah, I
not
mean,
a
you don't have
which
to,
for
but
those listening at
gonna,
home is not a required facet of It's Getting Pretty Late with Jake Landau. Do what you want to do while listening, but I am a sober host, and that is that. But yes, it does show a rather interesting perception, especially because, like, there is a large segment of the liberal staff population, liberal donors, liberal volunteers, who perceive Bill Maher as racist and targeting them for their ethnicity, whether they're Muslim or Chinese. He has a he only what I believe he tweeted very recent, or Fox News on a tweet reported on it, that he said that China is the new Islam in terms of being a threat, which
yeah.
is bigoted on several different levels and is very hard to unpack. So what do you make of
Yeah, I mean,
that now
Bill
being a
Maher.
welcome endorsement in a liberal race?
Yeah, well, Bill Maher, I mean, has always been a bigot, but he's gotten considerably worse, I think, over the years. He's gotten quite close with Barry Weiss, who, I mean, is a total hack. Um, and I actually remember Freeland, I think soon after Trudeau was elected, she was on Real Time. I mean, she's been on his show a lot, right? Because she used to be a journalist. And I remember Bill going on, you know, one of his characteristic Islamophobic tirades, in Freeland, like defending Muslims. I remember thinking that she didn't do a very good job defending her position, but like you know, I used to watch Bill Maher quite a bit when I was much younger.
I think there are a
Just
lot
because,
of aspiring left-wing individuals who are, like, in their young teens. They want to break out. They want to see political opinions they agree with exposed in a more aggressive and more upfront way that they don't need to feel apologetic for. They're starting to diverge themselves from their parents' political views, start to really
mhm.
come into their own ideology. So, that, as someone who was unfortunately a Reddit atheist, I understood the
Me
appeal of
too.
Bill Maher and stuff like the movie Religulous. I had a copy of The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, and then I think the worst thing I ever did to my family was that my father borrowed that copy and read it too.
Oh yeah, it was actually because it was. I was also. I mean, I think that's probably how I became aware of Bill Maher and just, I mean, at that time, right? There was before podcasts, so it was like you watch Jon Stewart,
Oh
watch
yeah.
Bill Maher, and that's like the range of political comedy and commentary.
And that kind
Um,
of globalized influence now of those US late night talk shows kind of has now reduced the liberal leadership race to, do you like Jon Stewart's endorsement? Do you like Bill Maher's endorsement?
yeah, which is,
And there's a
I mean,
degeneracy in that.
I hadn't even thought of that. I forgot that Carney like kind of launched his campaign on the Daily Show.
It
Um,
felt like both of them were being like, "Hey, I've been a guest before. Can you help me out here?" And to be fair, relationship building is an important skill in politics, so congrats to them on that front. But it does make them feel very similar in a way that isn't anything to do with left or right policy, but more in a way to do with Canadian identity, and a way that we can only help but be more sensitive to now with the current economic trade war that we've launched as of yesterday. Yeah.
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 And it will be interesting to see how that impacts the liberal leadership race. But before we move on, I wanted to ask you, because you're of course involved in with the Liberal Party in a way that I'm certainly not.
Indeed, I am
Um,
partisan
uh,
and
uh,
proud.
yeah, and you're on, the sort of, I would say, the far left of the Liberal Party of Canada.
I
Um,
have personally taken the tent poles of the big tent and I've yanked them out of the ground and ran until they grabbed me and tackled me to the ground.
but I was wondering, who do you like in this race? Because it doesn't seem like there is really progressive or social democratic option. Like, is Karina Gold, I know, is trying to position herself as the progressive candidate, but I was just reading that she wants to like cut the GST.
Yeah,
um
I was initially considering Karina Gould, and the funny thing is, you're right, because part of what I like to write about is that I am involved with the Liberal Party. I still do active organizing, and I've even helped a little bit on this provincial election already. So I don't completely step myself independently from the opinions I write. And also, I've realized, well, wait a minute, they are called opinions. If the bias is made explicit, that's just what a normal opinion is. So, this is obviously an opinion platform as well. Like, we both talk about news, but we give our thoughts on it, we give our slant. On this leadership race, I'm not involved with any team currently. I've had one person from the Mark Carney team ask me for help by asking me for an old resource from a previous thing he needed me to give him. I had the copy of it, so I gave it to him, but I haven't done anything else. And most people in that campaign probably wouldn't know I did that. So I'm happy for that to get clipped out of context. And if you want to see the next thing clipped out of context, make sure to subscribe to this podcast. Gould lost me when she proposed the GST tax cut, which would go down to 4%, ostensibly for only a year, but temporary my ass. That would be permanent, the same way that the cut down to 5% was permanent. Newsflash for Gen Z kids, it wasn't always 5% GST, and also there wasn't always HST. But that's a story for another time, young grasshoppers. Freeland, automatic no, just because, listen, we all know about her grandfather. I don't think you're responsible for what your ancestors do. I do think that you are responsible if you downplay it, and she has, and that's a no-go out of pocket for me.
yeah.
I feel like I kind of Mark Carney is the one I like the most, I guess, just because he's coherent, he's skilled, he knows how to run things, he knows what he's doing. The question is just how many policies will I agree with, and that is a very bleak place for the race to be in, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that. Like, he's getting rid of the carbon tax. Well, where that's clearly, I mean, that's the consensus now.
Yeah,
I mean, carbon
yeah,
tax, not my favorite way to address the issue of emissions. But I mean, if you're going to get rid of it, you better have something to replace it with that reduces
indeed.
emissions by the same amount,
And a
which
large,
actually isn't that much,
yeah,
or by more.
and a
And
large
I
degree of
appreciate that
voters in the Liberal Party, at least, seem to agree, and that the leader that they want needs to have a carbon plan, if not that carbon plan.
Yeah, but I appreciate that he is sticking with the emissions cap, because I think that is, again, it's odd. It doesn't it's not as aggressive as it, I think, needs to be, but it's also, we'd be the first country in the world to have one. So I think in that respect, it's an important policy, and I'm glad to see him stand by it, and not just throw out every piece of climate policy because of right-wing disinformation campaigns.
This episode of It's Getting Pretty Late with Jake Landau is sponsored by me. Yes, while all of my content, both in written and podcast form, is available for free without a paywall, please understand that creating this content requires a lot of time, effort, and money. Any financial assistance you can provide through a paid subscription to my Substack is greatly appreciated. Please consider going to jakelandau.ca/subscribe, where for a very low monthly fee or an even lower annual cost, you can get a subscription and support independent journalism. Thank you very much. Welcome back from the break. We're back with Jeremy Appel, who we will be going over this week's 3 of our key headlines. We'll be going over 2 that made a lot of news, and then a third one which didn't make as much news, but I think is pretty important, and I want you to hear about it anyways. And we'll keep on going with that format for the foreseeable future. Now, the first headline topic this week is obviously what's on every Canadian's mind, the trade war with the United States. Jeremy, why don't you give us your initial thoughts on that? Because we've got Donald Trump, as threatened on February 1st, launched his 25% tariffs on Canadian goods and products, but on energy, it will instead only be a 10% tariff. So on things like the electricity that we export, and on oil and gas from the prairies. Jeremy, what's your take on this, and what's your take on how Trudeau's responding?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to say about this right now. I mean, yeah, but I would say one thing that I think has gotten lost in a lot of the discussions over this is the issue of free trade and the failures of what was called NAFTA when it was signed in 1993. Now it's the U.S., Mexico, Canada Free Trade Agreement, and the fact that it didn't really improve anyone's lives except for a small investor class that got increased mobility, and as a result, working people's jobs became more precarious, wages stagnated, of course more economic activity led to more environmental damage, I mean, increased corporate control over states through the investor state dispute mechanisms that are fortunately falling out of fashion these days. So It's interesting, right? Because before our lifetimes, like tariffs were a normal thing, right?
Yeah.
Governments wanted to protect their domestic industries. So it was like, all right, if you want to compete, you gotta pay a premium. Um, but I think the problem is that our economy is so intertwined with the American economy and the Mexican economy
And part of that
that
liberalization of trade with the United States was a result of the Depression. When we talk about that, when politicians have talked about a 90-year history going back to 1935, it wasn't motivated really out of the goodness of our and the Americans' hearts that we wanted to become such good friends. It was that we needed an economic boost, and trade provided that.
Mhm. Yeah, so I think that's an important context for this is the failures of free trade, which was a big part of Trump's appeal, particularly in the 2016 election, was to talk about how these Rust Belt states where that were key to his first victory and his second victory, right? Like places like Ohio and Michigan and Wisconsin were just decimated by free trade. And the idea is we're going to bring back our domestic industry. But we don't live in that world anymore where you can just slap tariffs on things, right? Like America is so dependent upon Canada, in Mexico, in Europe, in China, that um you're only just going to make things more expensive for Americans, and I suspect that the Trump's policy, because now he's talking about slapping tariffs on the EU. I mean, he's just going to impose tariffs on everyone, is going to lead to severe, I mean, economic collapse from the Americans. And unfortunately, Canada doesn't have enough time to really diversify its relationships in the way that we need to before that eventuality takes place. Of course, also, I mean, Trump's talked about making Canada the 51st state.
And that does seem to be grabbing increasing attention, because when he's been asked what steps Canada can do to ameliorate his reasoning for the tariffs, it's arbitrarily been given as there is nothing you can do, or we won't apply a tariff to someone who is a state, so join as a state. There is a creeping realization that perhaps it isn't a trade war, but rather a war.
Yeah, I mean I mean it's both, but I think Trump is setting the stage for, I mean, if Canada starts to say increase its ties with China, I think a lot of countries, if they're targeted by America's tariffs, will just deepen its trade relationship with China and India. In other countries that have even bigger markets than the United States.
And this puts Taiwan particularly in between a rock and a hard place, because the United States is now abandoning patronage of them, so it drastically reduces their stability as an independent power.
Yes, but I would say that also the idea that Taiwan is like an independent state that needs to be protected from Chinese influence is relatively new idea, right? I mean, going back to like Nixon, of course, visiting Mao Zedong and Jimmy Carter, I mean that right, they developed the one China policy that was like, no, we recognize the
to be
PRC
fair,
as
there
China,
was always a one China policy. It's just that after they visited China, the mainland, they decided the Kuomintang.
That the one China was
yeah,
the bigger China.
China is now China and not this island off of China that is not China but is called China. And depending on whether or not you call it China, the Pan Blue or the Pan Green coalition will either be very happy or very mad.
Yeah, but I mean, like, Taiwan is part of China. Like, it has a separate form of government, and but it is very interconnected with China in the same way that Canada is very interconnected with the United States.
There is. People do forget that China and Taiwan do have trade with each other. At the same time, like, Taiwan also has a military, and their own they do have, while they may not have the recognition of sovereignty that they wish from many states, they do have more ability to project force to maintain their sovereignty than most states do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and but I was thinking about this yesterday, and it seems like the closer Canada and other U.S. allies get with China, the greater risk we have a scenario like Ukraine, where the U.S. is threatened by us getting closer and closer to hostile powers, and then they invade, like Russia invaded Ukraine, right? And I think that's the move when Canada becomes like part of the United States, right? Obviously, Trump is trying to use tariffs as like to beat us into deeper integration with America, right? By causing this pain and being like, well, I can make it stop if we reopen the free trade agreement and you make all these concessions that you don't want to make. And
so you fear that if we do sufficient economic pain back to them, that they'll flip over the game board and point guns at us and say we win.
Well, I mean, maybe, but I was thinking more in terms of like establishing deeper relations with China and other countries that the United States is hostile towards. I think that would be the pretext for actually invading Canada. But I do think it is interesting. I did want to talk about the tariffs, which are of course 25%, except for energy, as you mentioned, which is 10%, which I think part of that is due to Danielle Smith's bootlicking and doing her own approach to the tariff threat and not being on side with all the other premiers, though cracks in that alliance are already showing, as Scott Moe in Saskatchewan, Francois Legault in Quebec.
Could it be that Trump intentionally shaped the tariffs in a way that specific provinces would be hurt less based on their exports, that Alberta would be hurt less by tariffs, and as a result, it could break pan-Canadian solidarity on the issue by spreading the pain unequally and putting the most pain on provinces where it's the least acceptable to spend federal dollars?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting, but I don't think Trump really has an understanding of Canadian politics.
Well,
like, I don't
Trump,
think
his people who have laid it out for him. They
probably have a better understanding.
At a certain point, even if he is a puppet king and he's not very conscious most of the time, the people around him are him for all intents and purposes.
I mean, I think part of it is that the U.S. needs Canadian oil. Like that, and I mean, we need the U.S. to buy Canadian oil because no one else wants it. And
well, thankfully, America has never violated anyone's sovereignty for oil before.
Yeah. Well, I don't think it's going to be over oil. If
uranium
if
too.
Invade Canada. Yeah.
Potash for good measure.
Yeah, Saskatchewan's got a lot of both of those.
The Americans get 85% of their potash from Canadian sources.
Right.
They're that if you are a paranoid man, you don't want to have that reliance on another country.
But the thing is, the fact that the US is going softer on Canadian energy than everything else in the Canadian economy, I mean, they're really showing that that is their weak point. So if we're going to retaliate,
hit them there.
But the problem is that Smith and Mo won't permit that, right? For various reasons.
To be fair, the federal government doesn't need their permission. Trade policy is federal, and the federal government could just declare it to be done unilaterally.
I mean, yes, but there's also, right, like Supreme Court has ruled that the federal government can't place restrictions on production, right? Of oil and gas, which is why they had to
but they can say that
system.
a pipeline is a national security issue, that it's I don't imagine any Supreme Court of Canada, at least with the current justices, that would interpret, an existential threat, a state of war in effect, to require the federal government keep a pipeline open to an enemy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I mean, it gets dicey too when we're talking about national security and national interest. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't. It's just based on what I read in the news. But Trudeau has said that he's not going. The retaliation isn't going to target any province in particular, which already takes that off the table of retaliating with energy exports, because
I don't think he said
those are mostly
that.
coming from Alberta.
I think he said he wouldn't do it without sharing the load, which would potentially mean that if there was something affecting oil, that there would then be a subsidy specifically for Alberta, Saskatchewan, resource provinces that will be disproportionately affected by an export ban.
Right. And also, of course, Ontario and Quebec export a lot of electricity to the States, which is another point of vulnerability. So, yeah, I mean...
the plan is clear. Times. We shut off the power before the Super Bowl.
Yeah, I mean, Mexico cut off its avocados and alcohol, and in time for the Super Bowl, that might
Mexico and us have a lot in common right now, and between us we only have one problem, and if we each go halfway, we can deal with that problem between us, and then we don't really have to worry about that problem ever again.
But yeah, I mean, but seeing how now Trump, that's his go-to is just tariffs. Yeah, you don't like what we're doing? Okay, tariffs.
Yeah.
The more you use it, the less blunt of an instrument it is, because then all these other countries,
you're essentially creating your own anti-American trade bloc. Because the more of them that are tariffed, then they're all like, well, we may as well trade with each other. So you do see it as ultimately self-defeating, but there's going to be a lot of pain in the middle.
Yeah, and I mean, this isn't entirely analogous, but you look at how Russia has been able to get around European and Canadian and American sanctions. It's just been like, all right, well, we'll just trade more with China and India and Brazil.
Cryptocurrency ultimately did kill the idea of fully controlling the flow of currency, didn't it?
Yeah, don't give Danielle any ideas.
Yeah. All right. Moving on to our second topic of the week, the Ontario general election has kicked off after Doug Ford, after promising for several months that he wasn't going to do it, that there was no plans for a snap writ that would call an election in late February. Guess what, folks? There's going to be an Ontario provincial election in late February. Jeremy, what are your thoughts on the current state of the horse race? Which of the three leaders has got your eye as the favorite?
Well, as an outsider, I think Ford is going to win. I think there's a reason he's calling the election now, and it's nothing to do with tariffs. It's that he knows he can win, and Ford, in times of crisis, I think has shown that he's very good at putting on a brave face and saying all the right things that resonate with a lot of people who really ought to know better, and pretending that he is the man to lead during this crisis and not to look at his actual policies. I mean, I'm not in Ontario, so you would have more insight into this than me, but is there, I would imagine there's going to be some backlash to him being this opportunistic in calling the election now, when the polls are favorable to him, right? I mean, it's
we have
more than a year
one
out.
precedent. We have one precedent, and that would be David Peterson calling an early election because he didn't want to have to keep doing the agreement with the NDP to maintain confidence. It did not work out well for him because people were like, well, that's not an appropriate reason to call an election. However, I would be very wary of reading into that as a future example, because something we have to keep in mind is that statistically, there are not many elections, and it's not like the sample is of the same data set. Like, riding boundaries change, the parties change. It's not really a very well-contained scientific experiment. So if we're like, oh, no, I don't know if you read the webcomic XKCD by Randall Munroe, but he has a whole thing where for every single presidential election in American history until the present day, there's no president has ever won by being X or Y. And then he writes, at certain points, no president with a mustache has ever won without New York. And then he writes the president where it happened in the year. You get the idea. So it's these are small statistical sample sizes we work with, and my general idea is that the voters decide what's possible, and if they like Doug Ford, then they won't care that he called it early, and if they don't like Doug Ford, then they'll use it as an excuse to stop liking him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, what strikes me though is that the Ontario New Democrats and the Ontario Liberals seem to be very weak to me, and it doesn't seem like the progressive vote is going to coalesce behind one of them, which is
they
how
have
the NDP won
problem
in
that reminds me of
McGuinty.
Australia. In Australia, where the Country Party, or they're called the National Party now, and the Liberals, who are the right-wing party there. They're both right-wing parties, but the Liberal Party is an urban right-wing party, and the National Party is a rural right-wing party. So rather than merge, they just agree to run in specific places, knowing that their brands would not benefit from a merger, but that they benefit from cooperation. I see a lot of that in Ontario, where the Liberals come in third because their union chops are terrible, and other places where the NDP come in third because they hate workers and all of their rights, and it makes me very sad. But I don't like that, folks. I'm just describing how it is. Don't send complaints. But
don't try and get Jake fired.
Yes, if you would like to get Jake Landau fired from Jake Landau's Getting Tired Productions, please write to Jake Landau at blank.ca.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be because obviously people in the Ontario election are going to be voting mainly on the tariff issue, I think, and uh, it'll be sort of a referendum on how people perceive Doug Ford's leadership, and I think he's very good at conning people.
Is that not
And
an irony
but he,
then that in a province where people aren't particularly progressive socially, they or economically, that the contest may become which of the three promises the best stimulus plan to deal with the tariffs?
I mean, yeah, I mean, Ontario though is, I think it's sort of all over the map politically. I think it's really, uh, in the same way as BC, right? Like it all comes down to the suburbs of the biggest city and how they vote. And Doug Ford, for all his flaws, knows how to win in the suburbs, right? That's his bread and butter, and Etobicoke and Scarborough and more outer suburbs like Mississauga and Brampton, and Peel region. But I think it's unfortunate that if he does win, which looks to me almost certain, though I'm not following the every twist and turn of the election, so I hope I'm wrong. Um, that he's going to use that mandate as a pretext to rip out bike lanes, say in Toronto, um, which I don't think is a popular policy. At least where, like in Toronto, where the bike lanes are.
The irony is that it's popular in Etobicoke, where he is a local MPP in addition to being premier. So it
right, he was a city councilor.
And there's also a joke that based on where he lives and based on OPP, the Legislative Protective Detail that premiers are assigned, premiers are driven around in a private car. They don't take public transit like you or I do, and they don't drive their own cars like most members of provincial parliament. So based on where he lives in Etobicoke, his car has to go along Bloor Avenue West, then down to University, to Queen's Park. So there's a very good argument to be made that he's upset that the bike lanes exist specifically on his commute to work, and that he sees people cycling by him while he's stuck in traffic in his car, not being able to do anything.
Yeah, just get an e-bike, Doug.
No, and it's funny because he literally did one of the TVO blind date, or the politician blind date show episodes with Jagmeet Singh, where they rode bicycles together in a bike lane, and Doug Ford was like, "Oh yeah, this is kind of dangerous. This people could get hurt because of the drivers. Someone should do something about that." Yes, someone should do something about that, Doug. Anyways, for those curious at home, I will not be neutral through this Ontario general election. I'm a Liberal. I won't tell you which party to vote for, but I'm going to tell you don't vote blue. And going on to our third and final topic, which is a more underreported on story this week. One of the worst aspects of Donald Trump's inauguration was the immediate attack on the transgender, non-binary, and intersex communities in the United States. Executive actions have been passed through fiat, essentially, denying trans, non-binary, and intersex individuals the ability to access basic government services. There are now serious questions as to whether or not trans people's passports remain valid, their government ID, their ability to essentially exist in society. One of the biggest arguments that has been made against allowing refugees from the United States is that this was not on a national level. Previously, Republican governments implemented these kinds of laws at a state level, and refugee law internationally, if there's internal mobility within a state to flee, then you are not eligible. But this is no longer the case now. In the United States, there's clearly a national persecution of trans and non-binary and intersex people at the federal level. It doesn't even need to be government persecution, mind you. It just needs to be persecution spread throughout the whole country. So the fact that it is government-sponsored persecution means there's now a very serious question. What should Canada be doing to help save the lives of queer people who are being threatened and persecuted by the Trump regime? However, Immigration Minister Mark Miller does not agree. Recently, when asked by activist Faye Johnstone and by the NDP as to whether he would amend the Safe Third Country Agreement to allow queer refugees into Canada, he gave a very flat no. He said that while he's concerned by these clear attempts at national persecution, that they do not make America unsafe. Jeremy, do you believe that somebody can be persecuted by their government no matter where they are within their borders based on the characteristics of their birth, and yet at the same time that can be a safe country?
Yeah, I'm going to go with no on that.
No is the correct answer. Congratulations. You have won a no prize.
Yeah, I mean, I think quite clearly to us LGBTQ plus people in America are in danger. Now, the refugee convention that Canada's signatory to is quite strict, right? Like you have to be fleeing government persecution based on a bunch of protected categories. I think this is a clear-cut case. I'm not a lawyer, but I think it's quite obvious that it is. But the problem is you can't obtain refugee status here from the United States because of this safe third country agreement we have with the Americans, in which we presume that America is, the land of opportunity and it's safe for anyone.
You would have to challenge the safe third country agreement in the courts, which could take many years. And you would...
Yeah, it has been challenged and upheld.
It was only upheld in part. It was said to not violate Section 7 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. However, it remanded it back to the lowest court to deal with whether it violates Section 15 of the Charter. So the issue is still before the courts, and the thing is, it's taken many years for it to get up to the Supreme Court, only for them to say, we'll rule on one part, but we can't rule on another part. You gotta start at the beginning of the queue again for that one. How many people die while that's happening?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, there was a case in the late 2000s, just this one I mentioned in my book, talking about Kenny's reforms to the immigration refugee system, a lot of which have been left intact, that someone was deported to Mexico. They were fleeing violence from a drug cartel, and if memory serves, the Immigration Refugee Board said, well, you can just move to a different part of Mexico. And then she was deported and wound up dead. And I'm sure that is not the only case, but that's the one that stands out to me most in my mind.
I remember a very recent example. I know Desmond Cole highlighted his case. His name was Charles, and he's bisexual. He's bi. I'm bi. but as well. And he was being asked essentially to prove that he was bi. And they were saying, because you cannot prove to our satisfaction that you are bi, we are going to deport you back to this place we know will persecute you because you have now publicly put yourself out as a bi man. And I was just sitting there thinking, how the fuck do you expect him to do it? Like, what do you mean proof? Like, do I need to go down there and kiss him in front of the immigration official myself to prove that he's sufficiently queer? Like, that's psychotic. Like, there are not significant social benefits to pretending to be queer. People don't like us very much. I mean, people like us more than they used to, but it sucks. Like, you get a lot of hate, like, and slurs. I would never change who I am, but there are hardships that come with it.
Yeah, of course, I mean, the United States, the State Department just took the T out of LGBT in its advisories. I mean, things are going to get really bad. I mean, even here in Canada, of course, in Alberta, Danielle Smith put forward a huge range of anti-trans laws that extend the arm of the state into further into schools, which is interesting because Danielle Smith started her political career saying that schools should be allowed to make more local decisions, women's sports leagues, and of course the healthcare system, right, by banning puberty blockers for minors, which is the people who use puberty blockers.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that strikes me the most. Like, they always talk about banning puberty blockers for children. The entire point of a puberty blocker is to delay puberty, and also they're temporary.
Yeah, adults aren't taking them.
Yeah, no.
Actually, I do think in Alberta it's for kids under 16.
Yeah.
So there is like a 2-year window when you're allowed to use them if your doctor.
But the problem is there are very real necessities for puberty blockers, even for people who are not trans. They're used to treat precocious puberty, which is when your 4-year-old starts going through puberty because their hormones are out of balance. And as a result, they end up it's not good to go through puberty that early. It's very bad on a child's body. So what they do is they prescribe puberty blockers, and it keeps them from going through puberty until they go off the puberty blockers, and then they go through puberty just like normal at the normal age. I think if people realize it's a temporary thing you do to get the timing right, I don't think, and that we've been using them for the purpose of medical use for over 40 years without ill effect on children, this is the purpose. That's what they're designed to do. Only letting people use puberty blockers after they've completed puberty is malpractice.
Yeah, that's literally defeats the purpose. But I guess my point is that that strain exists in Canada too, in Saskatchewan as well. I mean, Scott Moe hasn't gone as far as Smith, but after forcing schools to out trans kids to their parents, and seeing what Smith is doing just west of him, he's become emboldened. But I still think Canada is far behind the United States in terms of the anti-trans moral panic.
And indeed, in some ways, we've had forward progress. I know in New Brunswick, the new Liberal government undid the transphobic laws, which were similar, if not identical, to the ones that Danielle Smith has imposed in Alberta. The new Liberal government, under Premier Holt, I believe, has undone them and now made it safe and welcoming for trans children to go to school again. obviously the job is not complete in that regard, but it is important, I think, to take note of when we do win these fights, that it is not a slow, inexorable slide into fascism, and that we can protect the rights of trans and non-binary and intersex and other queer people, and make sure that queer kids live to become queer adults.
Yeah, and I think maybe to tie this back to the tariff discussion, there does seem to be this strain of sort of every man for himself thinking in this time of crisis. I mean, you saw how when Trump was complaining about border security on the northern border, a lot of people's instinct was to say, no, those are just on the southern border. The problem's with Mexico, not with Canada.
Which was horrifically insulting. Like,
yeah,
mind you, like, we need to be Mexico's friend now. Mexico is ideally one of our closest allies at this current point in time, especially because of our potential for sea trade bypassing the United States.
Yeah, and I think Canada and Mexico did like coordinate their retaliatory tariffs against the states, so it's not entirely like Canada's just abandoned Mexico, right? But I did think that
there was an impulse at the beginning, and it did.
I understand that too, because it is true that but also there, like, a lot of fentanyl gets manufactured in the States, so. Canada invests all they want in border security, but that's not going to stop fentanyl being manufactured in the States. But this reminds me of that in the sense where it's just like trans people fleeing the States, like, sorry, can't help you. That's your own problem. We're really sorry.
Why should we let these Jews flee the Holocaust? I heard that.
I
heard not.
Yeah, flee Gaza.
Yeah, it literally is. I've used this phrase repeatedly to describe Mark Miller, because, like, the way he just immediately snapped the "no, we're not going to take them," it felt very much like we were looking back at the MS St. Louis, the boat of Jews trying to flee the Holocaust and being told, no, none is too many. And then they went back to Europe and they died. And I do worry that never again is now, and that we are not doing what we promised we would.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that. I think Mark Miller has been a horrible immigration minister, and I know you agree with me on that. And it's very disappointing to see Canada, which on the one hand portrays itself as this, that we're so much more tolerant and progressive than the United States, and that's bullshit. But then on the other hand,
the only main refugees we've taken in recently are white Christians from Ukraine. To be fair, we did take in many Syrian refugees a decade ago, but this is no longer a decade ago. And recently, it's been white Christians and not Palestinians from Gaza or Lebanon, or both Palestinians and Lebanese people from Lebanon, mind you.
And don't forget Sudanese people, too.
And Sudanese people.
Had a very restrictive temporary visa waiver program that's similar to.
And there's always been a whataboutism about why don't you care about Sudan? And I'm like, well, your actions show that you haven't created policy to care about Sudan either. Like,
those people who say that don't care about Sudan at all.
And we are talking about Sudan, right? Because we're talking about it right now.
Yeah, I mean, they couldn't even tell you who the RSF are, and certainly not who funds the RSF, because that might be a bit uncomfortable for boosters of this.
They'll ask why we didn't care about Azerbaijan ethnically cleansing Nagorno-Karabakh, but wait till you find out that which country is their main arms supplier.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or yeah. I mean, it's so bad faith and disingenuous, that line of
Yeah.
argument. But
In
it is. I
conclusion,
mean,
then,
look, the
would you say it's accurate to say that our lack of commitment to international law has weakened it when we need it the most?
Yeah, I would say so. I think Canada and the United States and European countries have spent the past year and a half just totally sabotaging any sort of rules based international order, as they like to call it, and then are aghast when they have nothing to turn to when America's like, all right, yeah, we have a free trade agreement, who cares, you're getting tariffs until you start deporting undocumented immigrants to the extent that we want you to, and um, militarize the border, and uh, and yeah, I am concerned, but also watching with I think characteristic journalistic amazement at what's going to happen next, because it's going to get bad. Things are going to get bad. I mean, that is, you know
And when they get
uh
bad, you'll be here with us every week. Not Jeremy. Jeremy will be leaving after this week's episode, and you'll have a new guest next week. But you, the listener, will be here with us to find out how everything keeps getting worse, but you got to keep on trucking anyways. Jeremy, thank you so much for your time today. It has been an absolute pleasure.
yeah, thanks so much for having me. Really honored to be your first guest.
Thank you so much. That's our show for this evening. Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to purchase a copy of Jeremy Appel's Kennyism, Jason Kenney's Pursuit of Power, you can do so in paperback at your local bookstore, or you can do so in ebook edition at your typical online storefront. Or, my favorite option, you can borrow it from your local library. And, more importantly, if you'd like to support queer refugees fleeing persecution, please consider a donation to Rainbow Railroad, a registered charitable organization in Canada and the United States. Thank you, and have a good evening.